Well, typically generous of Brian, of course. And what a treat it is to be back here again, and hopefully this is going to go on for year after year with different subjects each year. It might surprise you I'm daring to talk about dinnerwares, given that the Wallace collection is so short on them. But what I thought I'd like to say today is to tell you literally what pieces were used for in the Sèvres repertoire. Because if you go to great places, like this is in Copenhagen, the Royal Collection dinner service of 1768 given by Louis XV to the King of Denmark, you see straight away that juxtapositions are wrong. Meat juice pots are on sweetmeat stands and so on. And you think, well, what's this all about? You often go to auction house catalogues. I'm very grateful to Jodie for this picture. Oh, whoops, sorry. And you look at it and you think, well, they're fabulous, they're fascinating, but what on earth are they for? And of course they look glorious piled up high in display and often were used as such in the 18th and particularly the 19th centuries. But I thought it'd be fun to think what each piece was intended to be used for. Now, as you all know, the Vincennes factory was founded in 1740. By 1745, it was making flowers, it was copying Chinese and Meissen porcelains, and gradually evolved a fabulous French style. It had a problem with the soft-paste material, particularly when you're coming to dinnerwares, because it couldn't take heat very easily. And yet, for all that, it produced some of the most exotically brilliant ranges of pieces to eat off, keep your drinks cool in, to enjoy, that were made by any factory anywhere. And before it really got going on the formal dinner service, it invented these fabulous rococo sculptural forms that are absolutely the apple of my eye, whether it's a little glass cooler on the left or a sauce boat that's looking like sea and waves and coral and so on the right. Fabulous pieces designed by Duplessis, all in about sort of late 1740s, early 1750s. And then you get, finally, in 1752, a group of plates being sold with compotiers and some wine bottle coolers, the sort of essence of an embryonic dinner service. It wasn't quite this shape of plate, but certainly the decoration is very similar to that service of 1752 for Duplex de Bacincourt. And I love him for sort of launching this idea. And then a little bit later, early 1753, Madame de Pompadour buys her first dinner service. It's with blue lines, flowers. It's absolutely extraordinary, rich in all the things for savoury and dessert that it combines. But still, we hadn't quite hit the apex of the designs that were created by Duplessis for Louis XV service that was commissioned in 1751. It was recorded to different shapes in the documents in 1752 and gradually was delivered to the king in 1753, 54 and 55. And it was the stable shape of dinnerwares right up to the French Revolution, with occasional shapes being added to the service, but it was the standard for the savoury and the dessert courses of the meal. And so there's a fabulous Duplessis drawing which transfers into an enormous and wonderful piece of Vincennes porcelain, a meat plate. So I'm going to take you through the Savory Course, the premier service as it was, which actually consisted of 3 different services, courses, according to Liger in 1711. And he talks about it being soups, stews, hot dishes, cold dishes, salads, roasts, meats, and so on. A wealth of enormous things. And we know in 1747 that 44 dishes were laid out on a table for 50 people, again, combining all these things. And I'm just going to work slowly through them. What I'm not going to do, which is really heartbreaking, because one day I'd love to do it, is the decoration for the centerpiece, of course, of the dessert. And I'm not going to talk about individual services. I'm just plucking services out of the air to illustrate the shapes. They too would make a wonderful subject one day. So away we go with the Savory Course. And of course you needed plates. In fact, the plates were used in both the savoury and the dessert services. That's just a range of 6 plates from the 1760s to the 1790s. It gives you an idea of the sheer scale and fancifulness of the decoration, whether it's, as the earlier plate we saw before, from Vincennes, or from 1756 onwards from Sèvres. And I love that Geoffrey de Belay quote. Do you remember it, years and years ago, when he wrote about the Louis XVI service, and he said, he was trying to prove, which he did absolutely, that the plates that were eaten off by Louis XVI tended to have a completely blank white center, but the border and the gilding was the same as the very elaborate plates with the hugely fancy decoration of mythological and historical scenes. And he said, you know, you really needed a plain plate to eat off, not least because you protected the painted decoration, but also how horrid it would be to get to the end of your lamb chop and find a rape scene underneath. Well, obviously, that didn't pertain to these. These services didn't have the choice. But it just gives you an idea of the elaboration, the richness, and the fascination of Duplessis' designs, because quite simply, you may have kept a fairly standard form going right through the 40, 50 years of the 18th century, but what you got different every year was novel decoration, different types and styles and colours that you can see so beautifully represented there, from mythologicals to chinoiseries to armorials and so on. And there was a soup plate shape made as well. It's hard to tell, but this is the Starenberg service. The soup plate with its deep well is on the left. The flat plate is on the right. The soup plate has a completely round and plain edge to it. Most Sèvres plates had some form of detailing or moulding on the borders, unless you're dealing with the Catherine II service, which we'll talk about very briefly later, which reverts once again to a totally plain, round form. So the soup plate's only in the Savory service, obviously. And before Duplessis got going on his designs for Louis XV, these were the kind of tureens that were being made. These are terrines, they're oval. I think these are both absolutely to die for. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with them. You notice they both have lemon or orange, sour oranges on the cover. These were, of course, very important in the gravies that were used and were squeezed over meats when they were served, and so it's traditional and proper that they should be there. I love the quality of the flower and bird painting, but actually I've shown details here because I'd love someone to tell me what these little indentations under the terrain on the plateau are for. Are they just to collect condensation or drips? You don't get them once you get into the Louis XV service. This is obviously quite idiosyncratic in the early years of the 1750s. But when Louis XV got his service, he had tureens of this shape. This is a little bit later. This is 1758 for the King of Denmark. And again, Duplessis added this extraordinary sculptural foliage to sort of strengthen and give those sort of celery-like legs a bit of a lift. And again, you get the orange flower and the fruit on the top. And it sat on a plateau like this. This is in Melbourne in Australia. And here you get the artichoke and the leek and more evidence of what the contents would be. These were for stews or for soups, and they would have, from Duplessis' drawing, it suggests that they would be served down the long sides of the table and then would be dished out, as it were, to the seated guests. You had a round version, which is called a poa-wal. It's named after a Spanish stew, an olio. It was very popular, first of all, under the reign of Louis XIV, but it went on being so for the rest of the 18th century. And it too could either have, as you see, a lemon knop or the artichoke knop. And for this, Duplessis' drawing suggests it was at either end of the table as opposed to down the sides. And it was for whole game birds and poultry and stuff, meats steeped in aromatic juices. And presumably, once it was served at the table, you would have lifted out the carcasses of meat and carved them on the plateau for serving around the table, taking your vegetables and your gravies and juices from the pot at the same time. And these pieces were the most expensive pieces in the savoury service. There were usually 2 terrines and 2 stew pots, just as the description in 1747 suggested, and they would have been absolutely brilliant, whether they're the great turquoise ground of Louis XV service or the rose ground that came later. They were always tip-top fancy pieces. The service that was made for the King of Denmark that I showed you the wall display of earlier is really thrilling because its stew pot still contains the silver liner. Now, these silver liners crop up in Lazare du Veau. They're presumably to keep the contents warm, steaming over a bowl of hot water, and would have been just dropped very gently into the stew pot before it was served. And the other thing that's wonderful about this service is, do you see the flowers within the lid? That too is very fancy, that you could whip the lid off and show not just sort of a great expanse of white, but this wonderful use of flower decoration within. So a truly royal gift. Now, after Duplessis' death, of course, there were new shapes that crept in, and I wouldn't like you to think that there weren't. So occasionally I've added 1 or 2 other pieces, just to give you an idea of this in 1777 that was made for Marie Antoinette's brother, the one's still in Vienna to this day, very fancy with a lot more sculptural detailing of corn sheaves and so on. Below is this tureen that was made for Montmorin in the 1790s, which is now in the Hermitage Museum, but is so fancy and special. Large, grand pieces. Both of these are in hard paste. All the things so far I've shown you otherwise have been in soft paste. And then you had your meat course where you had the great roasts or spit joints or whatever they were that would come in. The top left-hand piece here is made for Louis XV. This is 2 feet, 60 centimetres long. It is enormous. It was a firing tour de force. Antoine d'Albise absolutely collapsed when we gave him the measurements of this, because the only way, he says, it could go into a kiln was on its side, sort of top to bottom, diagonally across the kiln. Quite spectacular. And all the services had an enormous number of different plateaus in varying sizes, either for meats like that or for hot dishes, chicken fricassees, chicken in bechamel sauce or whatever it was, various other things that could be served around the table as well. Easier to reach probably than the great tureens. And with it, you need your sauce. There were 5 great sauces in the 18th century that were invented and were very popular. One was bechamel sauce, one was a brown or Spanish sauce, one was tomato, one was velouté, and the other, of course, was mayonnaise after the Battle of Mahon in 1756 in the 7 Years' War. This is a glorious example from the Comte d'Artois service, one of my all-time favourites, where you've got a little butterfly lurking like Brown's tie yesterday, just behind the handle of the piece, and it would have been set on a lozenge-shaped plateau. And there's a later version, post-Duplessis' death, made in the 1790s with a really crazy handle. But I couldn't not show you, rather poor slide of the one on the right, because John Whitehead always tells the story of going to, when he was very junior in the porcelain world, going to dinner with a collector who was very proudly serving his sauce in the sauce boat. And of course, as you know, it's a chamber pot for ladies. And don't ever get fooled. The next thing you'd have in your savoury service would be a butter dish, oddly rustic. It's very strange how the butter dish and the mustard pot still sort of echo their rustic antecedents, in this case looking like the wooden pot that butter would have been made in, with the little holes for the handles, as if you were still carrying it around the farm. And that was just for traditional butter. And as we heard, I couldn't believe the quantities of butter that was served on tables, as we heard from Ivan yesterday. These were obviously very important. And they would lead on to the little meat juice pots that you'd have. Now, in England, these tend to be called custard cups and to be associated with the dessert service. This never happened in 18th century France. They were always for meat juice, something like a jus de veau, where veal would be steeped in its stock and made into a consommé, which would be served in these little cups. Lids keep them warm. And there are 2 different models here. The usual one is the one on the top left and the bottom, and then on the other 2, top right, are a different shape, the one in the middle being invented for the Maria Theresia service in 1758. They usually had covers. If they don't have covers, they're missing them because you needed this to keep warm. Imagine the time it took all these dishes to reach the table. I think consommé could have congealed if it wasn't gently covered. And they would be set on plateaus like this, rather glamorous. I love the spiral effect. On the left-hand side of the Danish service plateau. On the right is the one from the Louis XVI service. There were usually 6 or 7 of these meat juice pots on a plateau, and they would be served rather graciously. And then you had salt. Well, you had salt and various other condiments. You could have single salt cellars like the one on the top left, triple ones like on the bottom right, and these were for salt, which could be also flavoured salt, flavoured with celery or garlic or whatever, or you had pepper, or Louis XVI actually had, or no, Louis XVI had a triple salt, which was of German make, but it was recorded in his inventory for salt, pepper, and for nutmeg. And then there was an amazing combination of different spices that you could also have in your third well, as it were. Often more usual are the double salts. There's one of the traditional Duplessis model, one of a later post-Duplessis death model on the right-hand side. And there you see the 3 sorts of salt from the Starenberg service of 1766 with a mustard pot, the little barrel shape in the middle. But it gives you an idea of the scale of these pieces that would be around the table. And the mustard pot is one of the lovely shapes, I think, of the 18th century. The very early ones, prior to Duplessis' inventions for Louis XV, though no doubt he was responsible for these as well, are shown here. I like the one particularly with the little strawberry knop, because you actually could get a strawberry mustard in the 18th century. And if you Google it now, you can find all sorts of recipes that I hope you're all going to go and try. And the fact that it's in a barrel is because, on the whole, the mustard was steeped in Dijon white wine, and the wine was, of course, matured in barrels and so on. And so, again, this is sort of rustic antecedents, although the one on the right, I think, is very exquisite, of course, too early for a dinner service. Another yellow one at the top there. The Starrenberg one shows you how usually in the early years they'd have a flower knop, and the one on the top right shows you how then from 1765 onwards you tended to get a fruit knop. But in fact with mustard pots that's not always the truth, and you can get the fruit knop much earlier than you can in sugar bowls and other shapes. And the mustard pot in a dinner service would sit on an oval platter like that. It would also have a little hole in the lid for the mustard spoon, which I don't think I've ever seen a Vincennes or Sèvres, and Bernard might have done, but no, wouldn't it be wonderful? So those were all associated with the hot foods that you got in the sort of first and second courses. The third course was more cold foods, particularly salads, and sometimes cheeses. And this is a salad bowl that predates Louis XV's service, based on a Japanese model, 10-sided, first made for Machaut d'Arnouville, very early in 1753. But it's a shape that was then absorbed into the dinner service in various guises. And the salad bowls could contain vegetables and, of course, salad leaves and so on, with shellfish and eggs and cold meats and various other things as well. And you had a range of different shapes. You had the feuille de chou, literally the cabbage leaf-shaped salad bowl, as you see in two different versions here. And it's always interesting one day to compare services, but the Starrenberg service, which was for the Viennese ambassador to France in 1766, he had 10 salad bowls. I think he had more salad bowls than anyone else in the whole of the 18th century. So it must tell you something about the man. That's what I like, as the individual characteristics you get creeping in. And of course, with your salad, you needed oil and vinegar. So here are the oil and vinegar stands. They would have had glass bottles that would have been supplied separately, but they're rather a beautiful shape, which actually also could be used without the two fittings in the middle, both for a cup and a sugar bowl in a little tea service not associated with a dinner service, or even possibly just for lemons on the table. And here comes the lemon juice par excellence. I don't know how much you know about Louis XV's dining habits, but apparently he wasn't madly keen on oil and vinegar, and he liked lemon juice. And so the factory invented a lemon juice pot for him particularly. This was the lemon juice pot that was intended in his great service that was left incomplete when he was guillotined. And in fact, tragically, he never took delivery of this, because it was delivered in the very month that he was guillotined. And so, sadly, he never saw it, and he never saw his wonderful plateau in the shape of a lemon. What more could you wish for? Prior to that, you do, from 1773, if not before, have bateau, boat shapes, as I was saying just now, for lemons, cut lemons. But this is rather special, the actual use of juice pot. And cheese. The early cheese shape is the one on the left-hand side. The one on the right is the shape that you get incorporated in a dinner service, though this is earlier than a dinner service. And you will recognize, of course, it's the butter shape with piercing, very fancy, lovely piercing. Now these, and put on little feet. This is because it would sit in the middle of a plateau, and it was for wet cheeses, presumably, so allowing the whey to drip away from your cottage cheese or whatever it was that you had in it. The plateau looked like that, and presumably it would have spared the table from being covered in liquid. Later again in the 1770s, you get both Louis XV and Madame du Barry buying small plates for brie to be served on. And the small plate, I think, is a small version of the dinner plate, which was actually invented in the 1760s for the English market as a tea plate being sold with tea services. But as the century progressed, you get it used for other things and incorporated occasionally in a dinner service. And there's this. We saw this yesterday. This is one of the most wonderful and fascinating shapes that was made. My all-time favorite is the one on the right, because the whole of that stand, instead of being gilt bronze, is made to look like a tree of coral on which these wonderful scallop shells hang. And we know that Madame de Pompadour had one in her inventory when she died in 1764. And also Nicolas de Beaujon bought examples in his service of 1765. And David Peters, after much discussion about these scallop shells and whether they're for sweetmeats at the end of the dessert course of a meal, or whether they're actually for putting oysters in, and nobody's truly solved that one, other than to say that scallops aren't oysters, so why wouldn't you have oyster shells for oysters? But who knows? But he thinks Beaujon bought them as part of what he calls a small fish service, a service intended only for fish. And so this may well have been used for oysters or scallops, or perhaps for the sweetmeats at the end of the fish meal. Who knows? But they are absolutely brilliant. And when you get them and are able to take them apart, and you look at the plateaus, they're beautifully molded, again to allow drips to run away into the furthest extremities of the border of the piece. And now we move on to the dessert service. The dessert service, the fourth service, as we just heard, was very glamorous. And as Selma Schwartz has shown, you didn't just change the table display. You could move to a separate table, even to a different room, which happens to this very day when you go to a feast at an Oxford or a Cambridge college. And if you had your hot pudding-type desserts as part of your last savoury course, the dessert service was literally, as we've been hearing, for fruit and for sweetmeats. All cold things, all carefully prepared in the office or pantry beforehand. And you'd come back into this table groaning, not with the wonderful silver centerpieces that you might have had for the savoury service, but very often with gardens and, well, you've just been hearing about, the magical Dutch houses or fantasies of biscuit figures and mirrors and flowers and so on. And there were standard pieces of the dessert service, apart obviously from the plates. One was the compotier. The compotier was literally for fruit compotes, for either cooked fresh fruits or dried fruits, usually in a syrup. It could be a thick or a thin syrup, often with spices added or orange and lemon peel to add to the flavour. And you'd have 16 compotiers in a service, which is quite a lot. You'd have 4 round ones like this, 4 oval ones, 4 square ones, and 4 shell-shaped ones. In fact, the shell on the left predates the Duplessis services. The service examples are the more easily identifiable ones that you see on the right. So these would be sort of piled with all these gorgeous things. No doubt you could also put biscuits and macaroons and other things on them as well. But with them, you would want, for your sweet tooth, you'd want sugar. And sugar bowls at table were very different from the sugar bowls you get with tea services and teawares. They had a large plateau, as you see. They're a big bowl, oval, with a lid and a handle. The one at the top is one of the early Vincennes ones, absolutely glorious. The ones below, they haven't got their plateaus, but they're more usual rounded ones. And remember that form in a minute when we see something else. And then you have different versions. This and this magical one that was sold a few years ago. Oh, yum, yum. And then you get them evolving to boat shapes, and then you end up with that amazing sugar bowl, pair of sugar bowls at Woburn of 1778 that commemorate a French naval battle against the English. So you can use your pieces for all sorts of wonderful things. The one interesting thing is that you don't get the great sort of bowls and things shaped like the fruits or the savouries or the salad boudettes of English ceramics, as I think of some of the wonderful English things. These are all much more sort of well-behaved and formal, which is rather sad sometimes. I wish Sèvres had gone mad. But and then you'd have jams and preserves, and you would have had them either in trays where you have 2 jam pots that are stuck on the trays, so you can't be embarrassed by them falling off as you move them around the table or whatever. Or you could have triple jam pots like that. And these always had these covers and lids and the tray, and matched, of course, everything else in the service. But once in a while, you get something amazing. And the top bowl is just such an example. It's this big. It's wonderful. And it's one of many that were made in the gift that Louis XV gave to the King of Denmark in 17 57. It's a fruit bowl. It's actually described in the annals of Lazare du Vau because he had to make mirrored plateaus to stand the fruit bowls on. Just think of that. We had that fabulous description yesterday about the coat of arms or something written in reverse so that it could be seen in the mirror on the table. Well, each one of the King of Denmark's quite big fruit bowls, fresh fruit, sat on its own mirror base. And they are so, so rare. There is one in London at the moment, but otherwise they are largely all in the Hermitage Museum, mostly in store, so you just don't get a glimpse of them, but they're very special. And another interesting shape, disappointing slide, I'm sorry, is a shape that's called a jatte anglaise, and this is like a large oval compotier. And I'm not quite sure what they were intended for. They were certainly in the service that Lord Melbourne, an English milord, took delivery of in 1771. In fact, they may have been invented for him, but they were certainly around in the early 1770s and went on being incorporated in services until the 1790s, like this version here from the Musée Nissim de Camondo. And then you get to ice cream. And we saw those lovely things that Ivan showed yesterday, those sort of trays for syllabubs and so on. Well, at Vincennes, right from Louis XV's earliest piece, service in the early 1750s, he had these little ice cream cups. Now, I suppose that ice cream, by the time it got to the table, however hard you tried to keep it frozen, by the time it reached you, it was probably in a semi-liquid state. So you had a little handle to help you sort of sip it back. And in all the services that have this shape on the right, it's a triangular shape. This is from the Louis XV service itself, so his ice cream cup sat on that. If your service had this shape, called the plateau bourré, your ice cream cup sat on it. But if your service didn't have plateau bourrés, your ice cream cup would sit on this little raised, what's called a soucoupe à pied, a tray with a foot. And you usually had 7 to a tray, and they would be served at table looking just like that, just like we saw in the illustrations yesterday. Now, Louis XV didn't have an ice cream cooler. The ice cream cooler wasn't invented until 1758, again, for Maria Theresa of Austria. Whether she asked for it, I loved what we heard about her yesterday. She seems to be an ice cream lady, so why shouldn't the first serve ice cream cooler be invented for her? And here you see one taken apart. It usually looks like that. And then you lift the handle off, boom. And inside is the inner liner here. And the ice cream and sorbet would have been pressed into that. And the outer part of the bowl and the inner part of the cover would have been packed with crushed ice and salt to help insulate it as much as was humanly possible. And these would be brought to the table and were served from a sideboard into the little cups and served to you at the table. And just to give you an idea, Duplessis' design going on being used right through to the 1790s, but at the same time, another shape coming in. Had the French Revolution not happened, who knows what would have happened to all those extraordinary new dinnerware shapes. Some of them, the new ones and the less so the old, went on being used in the 19th century. But there was a great new mood in the 1790s for new shapes in a way that there hadn't been for the table for many years in some, less specific examples. And then you get 3 different sorts of chestnut baskets. Now, I absolutely adore this one because of the chestnut on the top. You're in absolutely no doubt what that was intended for. Chestnuts from Lyon were brought out to Paris. They were cooked and peeled and then steeped in orange and lemon syrups. And the syrup would trickle out into the plateau. Air would circulate through this piercing in order to keep them from going too soggy. This shape we don't know of in a dinner service, but this one we certainly do, both of 1758. And this you will recognize as the oval sugar bowl we looked at, but just like the cheese dish, the extra piercings in it in these wonderful rococo cartouche shapes tell you that it's not for sugar, but it's for chestnuts. And then the third one of 1760, I love. And this reminds me again of something Ivan said yesterday about the croquant, because he specifically mentioned the covers of chestnut baskets. And I maybe Sèvres learnt from that and made the whole thing a croquant, really, not just the cover. But it's very cleverly worked to make you think it's a woven basket, when actually it's not at all. It's just the way the paste is cut to give you the impression of ribbons interleaving with zigzag patterns. It's glorious. Now, very few knives were made, very, very few indeed. So I just slip one in there so that you know that they did make knife handles. And ditto, very few spoons were made. I mentioned the mustard spoon, You get a punch ladle, you get a sugar spoon, and you get one other, coffee spoons. But otherwise, these aren't things that you expect to see in dinner services, and if you see them at all, you're incredibly fortunate. And now to the sweetmeats in your dessert course. This is a soucoupe papier. It's a little plateau that is on a foot, and this is just showing you flat on. It's one for Louis XV service. Again, it's got this marvellous effect of a sort of Catherine wheel. And on this, when it's flat, of course, you would have piled your sweetmeats, your marzipan fruits, your little macaroons, your crystallized fruits, everything you could think of into a pyramidal shape like we saw yesterday. And they would have been very glamorous on the table. But even more exciting is when you get double ones, and these are rare, and this was specially sent to me for this lecture by Woburn Abbey. I'm very grateful to them. It's from the 1763 Bedford Ambassadorial Service, and to have 4 like this in a service just smiling at you is too divine for words. And, you know, and I just wondered whether you had sort of heavier fruits around the bottom and dainty ones above, or whether actually you were unaware of the second tier when the whole thing was dressed. I don't know, but they are so beautiful. It must have been really fun to have got to the last one and seen what was underneath. And sweetmeats were also served in all manner of baskets, and as you possibly remember, and they published it beautifully, Selma Schwartz and Ivan Day did work at Waddesdon for a summer display one year, where they used all the baskets for either edible flowers or for different sorts of biscuits and so on. And there are loads of recipes for these biscuits and marzipan fruits and so on. And they could be sort of quite shallow ones, like the square one there, or the 10-sided one, or much deeper like this. It's a deep oval. Or my favourites are these ones. It's the same model, but just by the way you use your turquoise blue ground colour, you make it even more three-dimensional as an open-work basket. You know, 1 layer thin and pale, and then 3 layers deep and wonderful, and it sort of gives a whole music sort of rhythm to it. And the one below is interesting because it's only got the turquoise blue, but it's not pierced at all. And that was quite rare in a service, and not enough of these survive, I don't think, in order to help us really understand whether there was a difference in usage, whether they were pierced or not. Somehow I doubt it. And then we get on to what you needed for drinks. These would have been kept on the sideboard. This is prior to the Louis XV service. These are these magical, early, strange, tiny or larger glass or wine bottle coolers of such glamour and energy and beauty. And, for example, Madame de Pompadour in 1751 bought 41 wine bottle coolers, but when she had virtually no things to eat off of Vincennes at all, and you think to yourself, well, what was she doing with it? And I'm increasingly beginning to wonder if she didn't actually use them for filling with porcelain flowers and use them as a kind of cache-pot. But she may have used them for wine bottles. But certainly by 1753, Duplessis' designs for Louis XV, of which this is one of the great whole wine bottle coolers, were established. This shape was made in 5 sizes. The full wine bottle cooler that you see here for the King of 1754, then the same size, a bit smaller for a half bottle, smaller still for a topette, a smaller wine bottle cooler. The 4th size was for a small round liqueur bottle cooler, and the 5th size was a little glass cooler. So that's the biggest. Then here are 2, a whole wine bottle cooler and a half wine bottle cooler from the Melbourne service of 1771. Here are smaller versions as well. And then on the right at the bottom is a different shape, very rare, but you do get it both in wine bottle cooler size and glass cooler. And the usual way to cool your liqueur wasn't in a round liqueur cooler if you wanted it really strong. It was in one of these, so à liqueur, which were for the bottles of the spirit to be like files, almost like a sort of chemistry set. And you put your liqueur into it, and by chilling it, the water content iced, so that when you poured it, you had a really, really strong spirit. And they had a division in the middle, so that as the ice melted, it could flow between them. Very important services had them, and this lovely one at the bottom for Louis XV. And that's what it looks like looking down on it. There's very pretty pierced sections, so often lost now, and then you can see the sections slotted back in. I don't know why it had it more so. You could put 2 bottles in. I suppose that was the point. All the other coolers were just for 1. And I suppose if you took the cooler out, it might have flooded I don't know. But anyway, somehow the water level was levelled off. And then you have the glass coolers, really exquisite glass upside down in the cooler, being rinsed and cleaned. The one on the right is from 1753, and it's a shape that Louis XV service had designed for it by Duplessis. There's his drawing. The one we've just seen is on the left. The one on the right is unknown, lost. And then it was given to the Wallace Collection Handling Collection because it's redecorated. It was given as a fake, and it's the only example we know so far of a Duplessis design that never went into full production. So I love that fake. Added to which, it was in the collection of Richard Wallace as well, so doubly good. How smaller. Yes. And then here's a selection of individual wine bottle coolers, the two on the left, like what you've already seen, the one on the right, a different shape with an undulating edge that would have perhaps anchored the upside-down glass a bit more easily. And then there was this shape that was invented in England. We call it a monteith. We see it in 17th century silver work. But in France, it was invented again in 1758 for Maria Theresia of Austria. It didn't exist prior to that. And it went on being used for rinsing your glasses because, of course, as you know and as we've heard, the wine was brought to you at the table in the glass, and then when you'd finished it, it was returned to be rinsed and put back ready for the next person or whoever was the next type of wine or whatever. So these were quite important within a service, so crenellé, literally crenellated, licensed to crenellate. And then the last and the most important things in your dessert service were the things for making punch. You had a mortier like this, literally a bucket, in which you could mix your spirit, usually rum. Punch came from England, and rum was the sort of key drink. And you'd squish into it sort of fruits and spices and make a wonderful, strong brew, which then you would tip into the punch bowl. Some of you know the story about that punch bowl on the left, which is Louis XV's, and it does belong at Boughton House, the Duke of Buccleuch. And in 1992, when the Table Royale exhibition was on at Versailles, he wonderfully lent a group of pieces to the exhibition. And this was valued untold amounts of money. He couldn't believe that this sort of punch bucket would be worth so much. And when he got to Versailles and was taken to look at his display of his objects, he couldn't believe that all his pieces were on a table. And forgive me, Versailles, but they'd put the mortier on the floor as a chamber pot. Yeah, really let him down. And there at the top is the usual punch bowl shape, the shape that would have had a wine and fruit juice base that the rest would have been tipped into to then serve with a giant punch ladle, which are, I don't think we know of any, certainly not the Louis XV ones anyway, but a wonderful punch bowl. And then there's another punch bowl that emerged last year, you possibly saw it in London, of a shape that none of us had ever seen before nor since. It's always fun when you get brand new shapes. So that gives you a race through the standard dinner service shapes and some of the variations on the standard. Occasionally you get a tea and coffee service going with a dinner service. This is the one at Goodwood of 1766. The jugs on the outside are called coffee pots. There's an extra large teapot in the middle and two very large sugar bowls and a slop basin. And then that's only a portion of it. There are different cups, 18 of each, for tea and for coffee. So that's one wonderful variant. And then the other interesting things is the two services of the 18th century which conform to none of the models that we have seen, that are complete new inventions. Both were invented with the hope of making them in hard-paste porcelain, but for neither did it fully work. The first, of course, is a Catherine II of Russia service, commissioned just after Duplessis died. He dies in 1774. This goes into production from 1776 to 79. And those are the ice cream coolers on their ice cream stands. Their ice cream cooler there with the frozen icicles and the ice cream cups on its stand. Totally different and not used in any other service. And then the other one is the Arabesque service, commissioned by Louis XVI in 1782, begun in 1783 using Raphael's engravings and detailing from Rome. Louis XVI had a copy of this, and he wanted it designed by Masson, the architect, to go on different pieces. It is exquisite, it is gentle, it is beautiful. It was never finished. Production ceased in 1787, having tried to make it in soft paste and hard paste and failed, and eventually was, during the revolutionary period, given as a gift to a Prussian minister, and then was largely destroyed following the war, so the Second World War. So it's as rare as hen's teeth. And that's another of the services that didn't conform to anything Duplessis had done. This is by, this is La Grenée, the great milk bucket and the milk bowl, not champagne cup as it's sometimes called, that was made for Marie Antoinette's dairy at Rambouillet and was very individual and special. Now, I need to race through very quickly just to show you a few shapes that were used in the private dining in your bedroom or your boudoir with your friends. Everything else I've shown you was really for formal dining. So you needed to warm food. You had these wonderful food warmers. This is enormous. I think it belonged to Madame de Pompadour. It's a sensational piece, and you'd had a spirit lamp to have lit and warmed, like a veilleuse in any other factory. You'd warm food in a saucepan. This is for a rare a dish of barley gruel, and therefore it's got barley seeds around the outside. Or you'd have had your consommé in your private room out of this écuelle. You'd have had the plateau for your crouton, your bread and butter, or your toasties that you could have dipped into it. And the lid would have kept it warm between occasional sips, and also to have stopped your hair powder going into it, because this would have been part of your toilette. When you were being dressed and made ready for the day, this was the kind of food that you would have been served. And you might have had an ingenious piece like this, which allowed you to steam cook an egg in your bedroom, or to no, I kid you not, or to perfume your bedroom by vaporizing liquid perfumes. And there's a terrible, I'm so sorry, I just had this tiny little thing that Monsieur Nicollier sent to me in the 1980s of the metal fittings that he had that proved you could steam cook the egg. The cylinder contained the water. It has, on the right, a little cap with 3 hollow prongs. You balance the egg on that in the faceted middle section. And he said in 3 minutes with the oil and wick in here, you steam cooked an egg, justifying the chicken on the top. But alternatively, all the painted decoration is associated with the sense of smell and the burning of liquid perfume. So that's what you would have put your liquid perfume in and burnt it, and the perfume would have come out around the bottom of the chicken's nest. A wonderful, ingenious piece of the late 1750s. And eggs too. It's always said that Madame de Pompadour had exotic eggs, chickens in her menagerie, or even on the roof at Versailles. And I love the idea of someone sort of just handing through a window a little fresh egg. And and here you have an egg cup. They could be tall and slim like that, or chunky. And this we had such fun with at Sèvres in December, because do you see it's got 3 holes there and a hole here, which suggests that it was used for mounting by a Marchand Mercier in silver or silver gilt. And it's got these little spirals here. And I was just sort of banging on about how in the 18th century they used to mount these with egg cups and salt cellars and so on that could be used. And then some bright spark said, well, look at the decoration. It's a chicken in a little chicken coop. So no doubt that was for eggs too in your private apartment. And if you were ill or had a hangover, or you were feeling depressed or gloomy or had a cold, you'd be prescribed a milky drink to have in your bedroom. And because you were jittery with the fever, you wanted it in a cup that wasn't going to spill, so you have a deep well there. And they had these milky diets, 7 o'clock in the morning, so many ounces of milk, and then with beer, and then with barley, and then with gentian flour or something, until by 7 o'clock in the evening, you were sick as anything of the diet, and you felt better just to escape it. So, but that shape was only bought by Madame de Pompadour until she died, and then everyone had to have it. And then you'd have your little individual, preferably armorially decorated little tray for your biscuits or whatever, with a cup and saucer sitting on it. Exquisite. This is to die for. This shape is described in Lazare du Veau when he sells one to Madame de Pompadour for coffee, but I think you would have had it for chocolate or anything else. But it's a covered cup and saucer, again, keeping things warm. Here are the teapots and tea services that you could have shared your toilette with your close friends. Madame du Barry there and Madame de Pompadour here, very girly. And then what I think is a coffee pot for Madame du Barry of 1773. We again looked at this in Sèvres in December. And I so wanted it to be a coffee pot for her because it's sort of in the documents. And we had to get the lid off and see that it didn't have piercing for tea leaves to strain them. And if it was just a run through, I thought we could justify it's coffee. And we lifted the lid off and blow me down, no strainer in there. So that could be a coffee pot. And here's a chocolate pot, which you recognize with its ebony handle and its little top here for your swizzle stick to swizzle through the chocolate. All of these things used in intimate surroundings and often with hot milk in a jug like that. But this is nothing to do with food, although it looks like a cup. This is a tasse à la toilette, and this was for your mouthwash, your orange flower water that you could have rinsed your mouth with, or you could have used to wet cosmetics to ruin your face with killer lead powder and all that kind of kit. But I don't think that was for eating, and it's a very early Vincennes model and went on being made. And now I'm showing you something that I hope not anyone in this room has ever seen before. And if you have, well, you've got to tell me about it. This is a lid of a tureen that has just appeared. Isn't it amazing? That's the body. Has anyone ever seen that before? Poor Geoffrey de Belague missed it in the Royal Collection because it was mounted in gilt bronze on a Sèvres hard-placed blue ground and gold plinth, and then there was gilt bronze between the lid and the body of the piece, and it was just unrecognisable as anything. And it was pulled out of the back of a cupboard at Buckingham Palace a few months ago, and it was dismantled and reassembled, and it's absolutely riveting. And I'm heartbroken because I've looked for it everywhere in the documents, and the nearest I got, and it was so close, was a terrine de laiterie, a dairy terrine. I thought, well, it could. It's got basket weave. It's got the rustic dairy look about it. You know, maybe that's what it is. But the trouble is that was the shape of the 1760s that hung around a long time and then vanished. But there's no doubt, I think, that this painting on it is of the 1770s, probably. So it's fun to see new Sèvres. We're not all done yet, and that's why we want bright young things to keep going and change the history of our factory, because there's more to discover. And I just wanted to end on this because I love it. This is the first attempt to do a Sèvres dinner service in a display on a table in this country, as far as I know. All the mistakes are made of different things, and coolers on the table and so on. But it's the Duke of Bedford with his wife celebrating their lovely new display, putting the tureen, which were being too hot to handle, straight on the table. And I thank them for setting the mood going and making a lot of people like me, as I was growing up with porcelain in the 70s, and used to look at this service and this table and get a feel for how thrillingly, cleverly useful these highly designed and decorated pieces are that just have supplied generations of people in the 18th century with usable, functional objects and continue to delight us today. So, thank you.